do this. All right. So, when last we left off, we were talking about blocking in. We then talked about, after we block in, then we kind of go through the process of adding in contour lines. These contour lines almost make like a bird cage or like a wire frame around the object. Now, every object you do is not going to have this contour line wire frame around it, but I want you to start thinking of things as in this kind of three-dimensional form, right? The line is going to bend a little bit. You don't want these perfectly straight lines. It's going to flatten the image. We want to make this as three-dimensional as we can. We're performing an illusion, basically. We're magicians. So you want to think about things in contour lines. Now, again, like I said, in the future, whenever you're drawing, you are definitely not going to do this to every bottle or every object or every still life ever, right? But if you're having difficulty, maybe you have a really weird object. Again, something like this. It's a really odd object, right? It has kind of these contour lines on it. What happens if I do like a really organic object like this pine cone? That's going to be difficult to use and to think about how each little piece of these little tangents right here, they kind of go inside the object. That's difficult, but I can use these contour lines to kind of ease myself, okay? Make things a little bit easier for me. So keep that in mind. What we're going to do today is talk a little bit about shading and shadow and a harsh light source. That would be why I have this big lamp here. We're going to talk about a harsh light source, one-directional light, and how that harsh light can kind of bend and break around an object. So we'll talk about that. Bless you. We're also going to talk about how to use this kind of gridded off contour, cross-contour line drawing to our advantage with our shadow and shading. Okay? So just kind of give you an idea. All right. So let's do this. All right. So I'm going to grab an object here at random. Something simple. I already did a blue bottle. We'll do this cup. All right. So you guys can see this cup here. It's kind of square looking. It's kind of rectangular, I guess. It's got a little asymmetry with the handle there, but basically it's just a big square that kind of tapers down toward the bottom. Okay. So I'm very quickly just going to block this in. You guys know how to do this, and again, I'm just going to kind of buzz through it real quick just so we can see. But let's see here. So I'm going to start with the basic form of just kind of a square, kind of a cube shape. I'm just kind of feeling it out here. Now you remember that last time we talked about, even now already, it's kind of leaning a little bit. I'll drop this contrast. It's kind of leaning a little bit because I didn't put that center line. That center line is going to help me kind of guide where everything else goes. So I'm going to use that as kind of my main point to make sure that it is symmetrical on either side. I'm going to start to go through from there and kind of block it in from there. Thanks. Oh, okay. There you go. Oop. All right. So we're going to cut in like that. So there's kind of my cube, right? And again, it's sketchy. It's not perfect. And I didn't, by any means, I did not do a comparative measurement, which is something you definitely want to do whenever you're doing your still life. It's an example, and you guys don't need to see me draw the same cup 1,000 times. In this case, the handle, I'm going to actually turn this so that you can see. So we're going to say that the handle is coming from this direction right here. Okay. I'm going to kind of block it in as well. Now, maybe you can see right now, I have this thing right here where this object is kind of going back into space. It's what we would refer to as one-point perspective. We're not going to talk about that quite yet. That's going to be one of our later on projects. So for right now, just kind of eyeball it. If it's not perfect, don't stress. That's the purpose of this class, is to teach you guys how to get better at this. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it in here. Again, it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be. All right, so you get the idea, right? So there's my blocking in. That is done. Now, I could go through and say, all right, well, there's some rounding right up top here, and I could put in the whole kind of cross-contour grid, but I don't really need to do that. It's just a lot of excess work. What I'm going to do is I have this lamp right here. I love lamp. And I'm going to take my bottle here, and I'm going to turn on this lamp. Oh, gosh, it's like the surface of the sun. What you can see, just on this object, is that this harsh light right here is hitting very, very hard. The rest of it goes into a really dark shadow, right? Because there's very little light touching over here. Lots over here. I'm even getting, because of this kind of glossy surface on top of the cup, I'm getting a little bit of a highlight right there, right there. You see that? So what we want to do is start to think about, okay, if this is kind of flat on this side and flat on that side, right, kind of square, how is the light going to hit this, and how is it going to diffuse around? If this was a rounded bottle, the light would kind of easily kind of fold up and over, right? It wants to go around the object. Because this has a flat edge right there, it's going to hit here, It's going to start to creep up and over, and then it's going to have a hard time going much past this because there's just no light on this side. Okay? So take that into account for a second. I'm going to turn off this light just for the sake of argument here. Kind of put it over there. All right. So I'm going to look at my object. Again, remember to, just like with our blind contours, look more at your object, less at your drawing. I promise you it will help you in the future. I'm going to change colors as well so that you guys can see a little bit better. Use some red here. All right, so set that there. All right, so I want to think about that. So the light is coming right here, right? And if you guys can see where I'm at, looks like it's hitting right here first. That's kind of that glare. So I'll just make a point. It's kind of starting there, okay? Looks like there's another little glare right up in the corner, so maybe there's kind of a highlight there too. Now, there are lots of people who work light to dark, and there are lots of people who work dark to light. It's a matter of really personal preference. I am going to teach you guys working light to dark, only because you can always add more on. It's harder to pull more off. Does that make sense? So we're going to start with our lightest and kind of get darker and darker, and we'll just keep adding more on top. Okay? Everyone can laugh because I technically just said the word more on. Okay, so think about this handle is casting a shadow on the actual cup itself. So I'm going to simulate that real quick just by kind of sketching in some shadow right there. Going from the light into the dark. Kind of a medium tone all over here. And remember that those circles are going to represent kind of those highlights. I'm going to get a little bit darker on that side, as you can see. A bit darker there. Okay. Now what we want to do is try our best, and as you guys get more and more practice, it'll become easier, but we want to try our best to not have outlines on things. The less outlines we can have, the better. Now, you guys are still learning, so obviously you're going to have a little bit of outline, and that's okay. I'm not going to hold it against you, but realize that there are no outlines in this entire object, you know? It's just shadow and shading, okay? So I know it's going to be super duper dark over on this side, so I'm going to go ahead and just darken the living hell out of this with my red pencil here. And notice that I am going with the contour of this object. The edge is kind of this straight line here. It's kind of squared, so I'm trying my best to stay with that. If it was rounded, I would curve my lines as I shade, because I want to roll with the contour. I want my shadow and shading to go with that contour. Okay? So, I end up with something kind of like this. Kind of an even tone right there, darker tone over on this side. And it kind of starts to pull around a little bit. The handle is casting a shadow. Now I can start to think about, okay, well there's a inside, there we go. There's an inside of this object. It's hard to see because it's painted black, but you know there is an inside of this cup. It's a mug. So how do I show that? Well, you can see right here, especially because it's painted black, it's basically just a black hole. There's nothing to see inside here. So I can really go to town coloring that in. And again, I'm going to try my best to go with the contour. So it's kind of going back and like that. So I'm going to go this way. I'm going to color that way. It may not sound like a lot, but every time you go with that contour, I promise you it's going to start to build up that sense of three-dimensionality. I'll switch colors here once again, just to show you. I'm going to darken a little bit more. The reason I'm darkening this side of the inside of the cup, keep in mind, all of the inside of the cup is going to be darker than everything else. But the reason that this side is a little bit darker as opposed to this side, realize that if the light is coming here, okay, imagine that it's hitting right there, right? It's coming at this direction, a little bit of light is going to escape and get up on this side because that's where it's coming from, right? But this side here, there's no light source coming in this direction. Ergo, it's going to be the darkest thing on the entire picture. There's literally no light touching here, okay? What you can do, oh, this is dead, is figure out at this point, you've got kind of an overall shape and shadow going on. You want to start to think about what your darkest dark is and your lightest light, because that'll kind of give you your parameters of what you need to color. So, for example, my brightest highlight is going to be this guy right here, so I'm not going to touch that with anything. I'm going to leave it pure white, okay? My darkest dark, like we already talked about, is going to be over here. So I'm going to make sure, I'm going to make this literally just pure black. I am coloring it in, nothing more than that, okay? It just becomes a shape of darkness, similar to my soul. shape of darkness. All right. So that is the darkest dark, right? Now, I know that if this is the lightest light, and that's the darkest dark, that everything in this picture has to be between there somewhere. Now, there are art teachers out there who are going to make you do a thing called a grayscale. A grayscale, basically, just to show you, is whenever you go from extreme darkness, like so, to extreme light, and you kind of find that nice middle ground in between. I'll just pull one out here real quick for you. I'm going to use a technique called cross-hatching, which we'll talk about later on in the year. But you basically can see real quick it goes from white to light gray, darker gray, medium gray, dark, and black, right? A scale. Now, if this right here, I've already ascertained that this is right there, and that is right there, then everything else has to be in here. Make sense? Nothing else can be pure black, nothing else can be pure white, because it's already done, right? So then it kind of becomes, even though I'm making it myself, it kind of becomes a color by numbers, if you think about it, right? So figure out, okay, if I break these kind of gray scales apart a little bit, where is my, let's see, where's my medium? I'd probably say that this side of the cup is kind of a medium tone, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through and kind of lightly shade a little bit, just get a little something going on here, just to kind of match this medium tone. Maybe a little bit darker toward the bottom, kind of fade up. Anytime you go from dark to light, from a really dark and you kind of fade out, we call that a gradient. So I'm going to do a little bit like that, kind of fade this suck-a-duck up. Okay, so there's kind of my medium tone, right? A little bit of a gradient from the bottom to the top, because again, the light's hitting here and falling over. So that takes care of my mediums, right? Maybe I'll throw a little bit of medium on top here too. Now I want to do lighter, right? My lighter gray. I know that the light is hitting this handle, so probably this whole handle is going to be kind of a lighter gray because there's more light touching it. Make sense? Okay. So I want to make sure that the handle has a little bit of light gray on top. So it kind of stands out against this medium gray of the cup. Okay. Then I can go down one level, and I'm just going to keep going through each one of these tones. All right, so now I've got these medium or dark gray and a medium gray. So I'm going to say this cast shadow here is the medium gray, as well as the inside of this cup. I'm going to say that's medium gray too. And again, I'm literally just color by numbers. That's all that's happening here. There's no magic, there's no nothing, just coloring. Obviously, I'm going with the contour of the object. Again, don't forget about that, because you know how to do contour. But notice that I didn't put contour lines down. I'm just aware that there are contour lines on here somehow. Okay, so I'm going to do that. Get a little bit of tone on the inside here, like so. Then finally, I've got this very last color right here, so I'm going to move that up and over to this side. So it's going to be dark, but not pure black like this side here. So pretty dark. Now, we're going to talk later on about how to blend these things better, make even better gradients. But the idea that each shape that we see has some variation on tone, some variation on shadow, lighting, value, right? So that gives me kind of this three-dimensional cup. Now this is pretty angular. I can go through and smooth things out and make it look even nicer. And then finally, the last thing you have to remember is if the light is coming from this direction, there's going to be a thing called a cast shadow. Cast shadow would be equivalent to my hand is casting a shadow on the paper, right? Makes sense? So if this object is sitting here, there's light coming from here, it's going across, and you can see the shadow as it bursts away like that. We want to simulate that cast shadow, and we do so simply by coloring a little bit of the back, like so. Remember that it's going to be darker toward the base of the object and lighter as it gets away, just like any shadow, right? So make this nice and dark, fade away. Nice and dark, fade away. Okay? And that's going to give us, kind of our three-dimensional, well-shaded object. Does that make sense? Now you can always go back through and kind of, again, smooth things out, but that's the basic concept. We're using blocking in, we're using our idea of contour lines to tell us where the shadow is going to be and to help us bend the lines around an object. But we're going through and just thinking about paint by numbers. This is a piece, that's a piece, this is a piece. And you think about your grayscale, and where do these pieces plug in at, you know? Once you used all the highlights up, quit using highlights. Once you use all the dark blacks up, quit using dark black, and keep pickling your way on through until you get to the end. Pretty self-explanatory. Again, it's going to take a lot of practice, but does the concept make sense of basically color by number with shadow? Cool? We'll talk later about how to kind of blend things out and make them look smoother, because right now this is pretty angular looking, but this is what we want to work toward today. The last thing that I want to talk about, and it's very, very quick here, the last thing that I want to talk about is texture. Zoom in here. So let's say I was drawing a tennis ball, right? How do you get the texture of a tennis ball? Tennis balls are kind of lumpy, they're fuzzy, there's things to them. They're not just an orb, a sphere, right? I know this is not made of glass, so obviously whenever I have a tennis ball, it's not going to look perfectly smooth. It's going to have some texture to it. I'll let you in on a little secret. Okay? Whenever you're trying to do texture, say like this, something that's fuzzy, right? Instead of trying to go through and actually like draw like curly cues and crap like that, don't worry about that. But you're not far off. Just doing simply some squiggling, say like this example here, kind of like a shrub, I guess. A little bit of squiggles, kind of arbitrarily thrown around, make things look textured. It looks like I can kind of, you know, eat this. It's like a piece of broccoli or something. And the way I did that, basically simulating this kind of fuzz, is I thought about, okay, the light is hitting it from one angle, again, shadow and shading, right? It's going to be darker on this side and lighter on this side, because that's where the light's hitting it. So if I drew my sphere, right, the light is coming from here. I know the light kind of diffuses away across the sphere, right? Contour lines, basically. I know it's going to be darker on this side and lighter as it goes away. Again, go with your contour. Darker on one side, lighter on the other. Now right now it looks like a sphere, it looks like a three-dimensional object, but it's not really, I don't know, it doesn't look like a tennis ball, it looks like a, I don't know, olive kind of something. So what I need to think about is how do I add texture to it, and to do so I'm going to go through and basically just make little squiggly marks at random. I'm not even paying attention, just making squiggle marks. But you got to remember, each time you draw a line, that's basically showing shadow. So if I put a whole bunch of lines up here in the highlights, it's going to look weird, because those highlights don't make any sense. But instead I can go through, add some squiggles down in these dark, dark shadows, which is really going to add a little bit of contrast against that bright highlight. And honestly, trying to fade these squiggles out as they come up and around, it's going to add a lot of texture to this glass sphere, which is now becoming kind of a glass sphere covered in, I don't know, curly Q hairs, which is kind of gross if you think about it. But you get the idea, right? Starts to add a little bit of texture to it. Again, this is going to take a lot of practice to kind of feel out what is a good, you know, this would be kind of like a good squiggle because it's kind of random, as opposed to doing these things that you do in the corner of your math book. I would not suggest doing those. It's going to take a little bit of practice to think about texture, but we'll definitely be practicing it today. Cool? Make sense? All right, I won't prattle on anymore. Let's practice a little bit.